Let's be real for a second. The Book of Leviticus, it can feel, well, strange. It's this dense collection of rules about sacrifices, weird skin diseases, what you can eat. But what if I told you that all of it, every single rule, is built around one single explosive problem? Let's dive in and uncover the hidden logic of this ancient manual.
See, this is the massive question that drives the entire book. It's the cliffhanger at the end of Exodus. God has finally shown up. His glorious presence is literally dwelling in a tent among the Israelites. And now everyone's looking around going, okay, how do we survive this? This is a brand new, high-stakes reality.
And Leviticus, that's the answer. It is the instruction manual for having a holy God as your next-door neighbor. I mean, think about it. His presence right there in the tabernacle was an unbelievable gift, but it also introduced an immense, almost unimaginable danger for the people of Israel.
I want you to just picture this scene for a moment. God's pure, raw, glorious presence isn't on some distant, inaccessible mountaintop anymore. No, it's right there, in a tent, smack dab in the center of their community. This changes everything. Being that close to that much power requires a whole new way of life.
So, to really get Leviticus, you have to understand this one single word, holiness. It means to be set apart, to be whole, to be perfect. Think of God's holiness like the sun. Its pure, raw power gives life, right? But if you get too close without the right kind of protection, it's incredibly destructive. Human sin and our imperfection just can't coexist with it unprotected.
Okay, so how do you safely approach this intensely holy God? Well, that brings us to the first part of the solution, the sacrificial system. And this isn't just a bunch of random bloody rituals. It's a super carefully designed guide for how imperfect people can actually interact with a perfect God.
You can basically boil all those different offerings down into two main categories. On one path, you've got your worship offerings. You can think of these as ways of saying thank you or just celebrating being in communion with God. But on the other path, you've got atonement offerings. These are for when you've messed up and you need to say, I'm so sorry, and repair the relationship that your actions have damaged.
And what's really interesting is that the system reveals this key principle. The more privileged you have, the more responsibility you carry. Take the sin offering. If the high priest, or get this, the entire nation sins unintentionally, it requires the most expensive sacrifice you could offer, a bull. The sin of a leader has a bigger impact, so it requires a bigger cost to make things right.
Now, your average Israelite couldn't just stroll into God's presence whenever they felt like it. No way. They needed a mediator, someone who was specially prepared to operate in that high-voltage space between the holy and the common. And those people? They were the priests.
And becoming a priest, wow, that was an intense process. It started with washing, for cleansing. Then they were dressed in these special holy garments that marked them for their sacred job. They were anointed with oil, a symbol of God's spirit and power. And this is crucial. They had to offer sacrifices for their own sin first, admitting their own imperfection before they could ever stand up for others.
For a priest, you see, holiness wasn't a one-and-done event. It was this constant, ongoing process of maintenance. Any sin, any ritual uncleanness, it created a barrier to God's presence that had to be dealt with through this continuous cycle of cleansing and sacrifice. It was a life of constant, vigilant attention.
This was not just some job with a fancy uniform. As these mediators standing in the gap, the priests were operating in a place of extreme danger. The rules were not suggestions. The stakes were quite literally life and death.
And we see this danger play out almost immediately in this terrifying story about Aaron's two sons, Nadab and Abihu. This happens right after they were made priests.
So, fresh in their new roles, they decide to improvise. They present strange fire before the Lord. Now, here's the key. It wasn't something God told them not to do. It was something he had simply not commanded them to do. They approached God on their own terms, not his.
The response was swift, and it was devastating. The very same fire from God's presence that had just accepted the official sacrifices now burst forth and consumed the two priests.
And God's explanation to Moses just cuts right to the heart of it. Among the ones close to me, I will show myself holy. The message was stark, and it was unforgettable. The closer you get to God's presence, the higher the standard. Holiness is not something to be trifled with.
Now, this whole principle of holiness didn't just apply to the priests in the tabernacle. Nope, it extended out into the daily life of every single Israelite through these laws of purity, the distinctions between what was considered clean and what was unclean. And it's really, really important to get this right. Being unclean didn't usually mean you were being sinful. It just meant you were ritually unfit to enter the sacred space of the sanctuary. These laws were tangible, everyday reminders that they were a people set apart for a holy God. The whole system had this kind of internal logic to it, all centered on ideas of order and wholeness. I mean, take land animals. To be considered clean, an animal had to have both a completely divided hoof and chew the cud. If it only had one of those things, like a pig or a camel, it didn't fit the ideal pattern, so it was considered unclean. And this idea of wholeness and order, it extended absolutely everywhere. The laws created these symbolic boundaries between clean and unclean, order and disorder, the holy and the common. It shaped how they ate, how they dealt with sickness, how they welcomed new life. It literally wove the reality of God's holiness into the very fabric of their society.
So what do we do with all of this today, right? The sacrifices have ended, the temple is long gone, but the central message of Leviticus, this powerful call to holiness, has had a profound and lasting impact that we still feel.
This is it. This is the core command of the entire book. It's the why behind every single rule. The idea was that the character of the people was supposed to reflect the character of their God. Because God is holy, his people are called to be holy, to be set apart.
I mean, the influence of this one book is just staggering. It became so foundational to Judaism that traditionally it was the very first book of the Torah taught to children. It shaped their whole worldview. And for Christians, you literally cannot fully grasp the arguments being made in the New Testament book of Hebrews without first understanding the concepts of sacrifice and priesthood from Leviticus.
And that core command, be holy because I am holy, it doesn't just fade away. The Apostle Peter takes that central theme and applies it directly to a new generation of believers, showing that this call to be set apart goes way beyond the temple and its rituals.
So in the end, Leviticus, far from being just some strange, outdated rulebook, leaves us with this powerful and deeply personal question. It's a book all about what it looks like to live in the awesome, dangerous, wonderful presence of a holy God. And that leaves us to wonder, in our own lives, in a world that can feel so chaotic and disordered, what does it truly mean for us to be set apart?